Stop!
The snow had just begun to settle outside the Whitcombe family home when Diane Whitcombe raised her hand and brought it down across the face of her own daughter-in-law, in front of 19 relatives, 3 children, and a table full of untouched Christmas dinner. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sound in that dining room was the soft crackle of the fireplace and the faint hum of a Christmas playlist still running from someone's phone. Tanya Reeves Whitcombe didn't cry. She didn't even flinch the way everyone expected. She simply stood there, one hand pressed to her cheek, staring at the woman who had just struck her, as if she were memorizing every line on Diane's face for the very first time. What happened next inside that house would not stay inside that house for long. Within 72 hours, a grainy video clip would surface online, viewed by millions of strangers who had never met the Whitcombe family and never would. But that video only told half the story. What nobody in that room understood on Christmas Eve was that Diane Whitcombe's name would appear on the local evening news less than 2 weeks later, and it would have almost nothing to do with the slap everyone was talking about. It would have everything to do with something Diane had buried for over 30 years, something she thought had gone into the ground with her mother, something Tanya Reeves Whitcombe had accidentally stumbled onto without even realizing what she was holding. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By New Year's Day, Grant Whitcombe would no longer recognize his own mother. Harold Whitcombe, a man who had spent 41 years avoiding conflict at all costs, would be forced to choose a side for the first time in his marriage. And Renee Whitcombe Park, the only person at that table who ever dared question her mother, would begin pulling a thread that unraveled far more than one bad night in December. This is the story of a slap that was never really about race, never really about pride, and never really about one dinner table. This is the story of what Diane Whitcombe had been running from her entire life, and the daughter-in-law she never wanted who ended up being the one to finally catch her. Diane Whitcombe had always been the kind of woman people described as put together. Her tablecloths were always ironed. Her ham was always glazed exactly the same shade of amber every single year, and her opinions about family, tradition, and what she called keeping things proper were never a mystery to anyone who had known her for more than a week. What was a mystery, even to her own children, was why she had spent nearly 2 years finding reasons Tanya Reeves Whitcombe didn't quite fit at the family table. A canceled invitation here. A seating arrangement there. Small enough that Grant told himself he was imagining it, and large enough that Tanya never was. The question everyone would eventually ask, long after the video had already been watched by strangers in 40 different states, was simple. Why that night? Why? After 2 years of quiet exclusion and carefully worded comments, did Diane finally raise her hand at her own dinner table, in front of her husband, her son, her daughter, and her grandchildren? The second question ran even deeper. What did Tanya actually say to her, in the 60 seconds before the slap, that made a 61-year-old woman lose control of herself so completely? And the third question was the one that would take the rest of this story to answer. What did Diane Whitcombe's name have to do with a local news segment 2 weeks later that had nothing to do with race, nothing to do with family, and everything to do with a version of Diane that none of her children had ever met? To understand what happened on Christmas Eve, you have to go back to a woman named Eleanor Whitcombe, Diane's mother, who raised her only daughter in a house on the outskirts of a small Ohio town, where certain rules were never written down but were understood by everyone who lived under that roof. Eleanor believed deeply in appearances. She believed a family's worth was measured by how it looked from the outside, by who sat at the table on holidays, and by what the neighbors would say if they ever found out the truth about anything. Diane grew up watching her mother smile at church on Sunday morning and say things behind closed doors that never matched that smile. By the time Diane was 12 years old, she had already learned the family's most important unspoken lesson. Some truths were meant to be buried, not spoken. Grant Whitcombe never saw that side of his mother growing up. To him, Diane was warm, generous, the kind of mother who showed up to every basketball game and remembered every birthday down to the smallest detail. He knew she could be particular about family gatherings, protective of tradition in a way that sometimes felt old-fashioned, but he never once thought his mother was capable of cruelty. That is, until he brought Tanya home for the first time and watched his mother's smile tighten, just slightly at the edges, in a way he chose not to examine too closely. He loved his wife. He believed, foolishly perhaps, that love would eventually be enough to soften whatever hesitation his mother carried. Tanya Reeves grew up 900 miles away in Georgia, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs and still made time to sit with Tanya every night and go over her homework at the kitchen table. Tanya was resourceful, sharp, the kind of woman who noticed things other people missed. When she met Grant in graduate school, she noticed immediately how carefully he spoke about his mother, how he seemed to brace himself slightly before every visit home. She told herself it was nothing. Every family has its quirks, she reasoned, and she was determined to win Diane over the way she had won over every skeptical person in her life before, through patience, kindness, and time. For the first year, Tanya tried everything. She learned to make Diane's favorite dishes exactly the way Diane liked them. She remembered every relative's name after meeting them only once. She sent thoughtful gifts for no occasion at all, simply to show she was paying attention. And every single time, Diane accepted these gestures with a polite, distant gratitude that never once turned into warmth. It was Renee, Diane's daughter, who first noticed the pattern and put words to what Tanya had only felt. Renee pulled her sister-in-law aside quietly during a 4th of July gathering and said something Tanya would remember for years afterward. She said their mother had never once, in 38 years, treated anyone else who married into the family the way she was treating Tanya. Harold Whitcombe noticed too, though he said nothing. Harold had spent 4 decades learning that peace in his household depended on his silence. He loved his son. He loved his granddaughter Tanya had given the family. And he loved his wife, in the complicated way a man loves someone he has watched carry a weight for 40 years without ever once naming what that weight actually was. Harold had asked Diane once, early in their marriage, about her mother Eleanor, about the house she grew up in, about why she flinched slightly whenever certain topics came up at family dinners. Diane had changed the subject so quickly and so completely that Harold never asked again. He told himself some things were simply better left alone. By the time the family gathered for that final Christmas Eve dinner, Tanya had stopped trying quite so hard. Not out of bitterness, but out of a quiet exhaustion that comes from extending kindness into a space that never seems to return it. She still showed up. She still brought a dish, still hugged Diane at the door, still let her daughter run into her grandmother's arms with the kind of uncomplicated love only a child can offer. But something in Tanya had shifted that year, and it had everything to do with a manila folder she had found 3 weeks earlier while helping Harold clean out the garage, a folder with Eleanor Whitcombe's name on it that Tanya was never supposed to see. The folder Tanya found in that garage contained newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, along with a handful of photographs of a young woman who looked remarkably like Diane, standing beside a man Tanya had never seen in any family photo album. There was also a birth certificate, folded so many times the creases had nearly torn through the paper entirely. Tanya didn't understand what she was looking at that afternoon, not fully, but she understood enough to know it was significant, and she understood enough to know that Diane had never mentioned any of it in the 4 years Tanya had been part of this family. She placed the folder back exactly where she found it, said nothing to Grant, and carried the weight of that secret quietly into the holiday season, telling herself she would bring it up eventually, when the timing felt right. The timing never felt right, because Diane never gave her the opening. If anything, Diane grew colder as December wore on, finding new reasons to comment on Tanya's parenting choices, her cooking, even the way she dressed their daughter for church. Grant noticed his mother's sharpness increasing, but attributed it to the stress of hosting the holidays. The same excuse he had made for years. Renee noticed it too, and unlike her brother, she said something. She confronted her mother privately in the kitchen one evening in mid-December, asking directly why she couldn't simply let Tanya into the family the way everyone else had been welcomed. Diane's response was clipped, almost frightened, and she ended the conversation by walking away without finishing it. Christmas Eve arrived with snow falling steadily over the Whitcombe property, the kind of picturesque scene that would have made a perfect photograph if anyone in that house had known what was coming. 19 relatives filled the dining room, extended family driving in from 3 different states, children weaving between adult legs chasing each other toward the dessert table. Diane had spent the entire day cooking, refusing help from anyone, insisting the meal needed to be perfect. Harold recognized this behavior from decades of marriage. Diane cooked obsessively when she was anxious about something deeper than a dinner party, and Harold had learned better than to ask what that something was. Dinner began normally enough, with Harold offering the traditional toast he gave every year, thanking everyone for making the long drive, and reminding the family how grateful he was to have them all under one roof. Conversation moved easily around the table, the way it always did, touching on work, school, a cousin's recent engagement. Tanya sat near the middle of the table, her daughter on her lap, participating in the conversation the way she always did, warmly and without hesitation. Nobody at that table suspected that within the hour, this ordinary Christmas Eve dinner would become the reason strangers across the country would eventually learn all their names. The shift began small, the way these things often do. Renee brought up an old family photograph she'd found while decorating, a picture of Eleanor Whitcombe from decades earlier, standing in front of a house none of the younger relatives recognized. She asked, innocently enough, where the photograph had been taken, since it clearly wasn't the house Eleanor had lived in for most of her adult life. Diane's face changed instantly, a tightness spreading across her features that Harold recognized, but had never seen displayed so openly in front of the entire family. She said the photograph didn't matter and asked Renee to put it away, her voice carrying an edge that made several relatives glance up from their plates. Tanya, who had been quiet through most of dinner, chose that moment to speak. She said, gently but clearly, that she had actually found some old papers a few weeks back while cleaning the garage, papers with Eleanor's name on them, and that she had some questions about a man in one of the photographs who didn't appear to be Diane's father. The table went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone senses something has shifted beneath the surface of a normal evening. Diane's hands, resting on either side of her plate, began to tremble slightly, though her voice remained controlled when she asked Tanya what exactly she thought she had seen. Grant, sensing the tension rising between his wife and his mother, tried to redirect the conversation, suggesting they save family history discussions for another time. But Tanya, perhaps emboldened by years of quiet exclusion finally reaching some threshold, continued. She said she wasn't trying to cause trouble, only that she thought the family deserved honesty, especially considering how much emphasis had always been placed on tradition and truth in this household. She said the name on the birth certificate she'd found didn't match anyone she recognized as family, and she wondered aloud whether Diane had ever planned on telling anyone the truth about where she actually came from. Diane Whitcombe stood up, so fast her chair scraped hard against the hardwood floor, the sound cutting through the room like a small alarm. She said Tanya had no right at all, to go through private family belongings and bring them to a Christmas dinner table in front of children and relatives who had nothing to do with any of it. Tanya, still seated, calmly replied that she hadn't been searching for anything, that she'd simply stumbled onto it, and that she thought the real issue wasn't the folder at all, but the 2 years Diane had spent making her feel like she didn't belong in this family for reasons she was only now beginning to understand. What Tanya said next would later be disputed by different relatives depending on where they were sitting and how closely they were paying attention. But the general consensus was that Tanya suggested, without raising her voice, that perhaps Diane's coldness toward her had less to do with Tanya herself and more to do with something Diane had spent her entire life ashamed of. Whatever the exact wording, it was enough. Diane crossed the short distance between them in 3 quick steps and brought her open hand across Tanya's face with a force that silenced the entire room instantly, the sound of it sharper and louder than anyone expected a single slap could be. For several seconds, nobody at that table moved. Grant sat frozen, unable to process what he had just watched his mother do to his wife. Harold half rose from his seat, but seemed uncertain what to do with his body once he was standing. The children who had been running through the house moments earlier now stood in the doorway, having heard the sound and come to investigate, confusion written plainly across their small faces. Tanya sat perfectly still, one hand slowly rising to touch her reddening cheek, her eyes never leaving Diane's face, an expression settling over her features that looked less like shock and more like quiet, devastating clarity. Renee was the first to move, rushing to Tanya's side and asking if she was all right, while simultaneously turning to her mother with an expression of disbelief that bordered on horror. Diane, for her part, seemed almost as stunned by her own actions as everyone watching her, her hand still raised slightly as though she couldn't quite believe what it had just done. She began to speak, some fragment of an apology or explanation, but the words came out disjointed and incomplete, and eventually, she simply stopped talking altogether, lowering herself back into her chair as the entire family stared at her in a silence that felt heavier than anything that had come before it. A younger cousin, 16 years old, and holding her phone as most teenagers do throughout every family gathering, had captured the final 15 seconds of the confrontation on video without fully realizing what she was recording. She hadn't planned to film anything significant. She had simply been recording a short clip for her social media story when the argument escalated, and by instinct she kept recording as the slap landed, capturing Diane's raised hand, the sound of impact, and Tanya's stunned, unmoving silence afterward. The cousin would later say she uploaded the clip that same night without thinking much of it, never imagining it would spread beyond her small circle of followers. Grant finally found his voice, though what came out surprised everyone at the table, including himself. He didn't immediately comfort his wife, and he didn't immediately confront his mother. Instead, he sat frozen in his chair, looking back and forth between the two women he loved most, seemingly unable to reconcile the version of his mother he'd known his entire life with the woman who had just struck his wife in front of their child. Tanya noticed his hesitation, and something in her expression shifted again, hardening slightly, as though she were recalculating something about her marriage in real time, right there at the dinner table. Harold finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm in a way that startled the family, since Harold rarely raised his voice or inserted himself into conflict of any kind. He asked Diane, directly and without softening the question, whether she was finally going to tell the family the truth about her mother, about the photograph, about the man in it, and about why she had spent 40 years avoiding any conversation about where she actually came from. Diane looked at her husband with an expression of betrayal, as though his question wounded her more deeply than anything that had happened in the previous 5 minutes, and she said nothing in response, simply staring down at the untouched food on her plate. The dinner ended shortly after that, relatives quietly gathering coats and children, murmuring awkward goodbyes, several of them avoiding eye contact with Diane entirely as they filed out into the snow. Tanya left with Grant and their daughter, the car ride home almost entirely silent except for their daughter's confused questions about why Grandma had hit Mommy, questions neither parent seemed prepared to answer honestly. By the time they arrived home, Tanya had made a decision she hadn't fully articulated even to herself yet, though the seeds of it had been planted the moment her cheek met Diane's palm at that table. The video appeared online less than 18 hours later, uploaded quietly by the 16-year-old cousin who had no idea what she was setting into motion. Within 6 hours, it had been shared several thousand times. Within 24 hours, that number climbed into the hundreds of thousands, as strangers across the country reacted with outrage, confusion, and a flood of speculation about what could have possibly led to that moment. Comment sections filled rapidly with accusations, assumptions, and demands for context that nobody outside the family actually possessed. The video, stripped of everything that came before it, showed only a slap and a silence, and the internet filled in the missing pieces with whatever story seemed most satisfying. Grant discovered the video had gone viral when a coworker sent him a link the following morning, asking with obvious concern if the woman in the video was really his mother. Grant stared at his phone for a long time before responding, watching the 15-second clip over and over, noticing details he hadn't fully processed in the moment, the exact angle of his mother's hand, the exact stillness in Tanya's posture afterward. He called his sister immediately, and the two of them spent the next several hours trying to understand how quickly their private family crisis had become public entertainment for millions of strangers who knew none of the history behind it. Diane refused to look at her phone at all that first day, though Harold eventually showed her the video against her wishes, believing she needed to understand the scale of what had happened. Diane's reaction was not anger or defensiveness, as Harold expected, but something closer to quiet terror. She asked Harold, in a voice smaller than he'd heard from her in decades, whether people online knew about her mother, about the photograph, about any of it. Harold told her the video showed nothing except the slap itself, that the folder and the conversation preceding it remained private, at least for now. Diane didn't seem comforted by this. If anything, she seemed to understand that this was only the beginning. Local news picked up the story within 3 days, framing it initially as a viral video of a family confrontation with racial undertones, since Tanya was black and Diane was white, and the internet had quickly assigned that narrative to the incident without any deeper context. A reporter from the local affiliate reached out to the family requesting comment, and Renee, against her mother's wishes, agreed to a brief interview, explaining that the situation was far more complicated than a single video could convey, though she stopped short of revealing the details about Eleanor's hidden past, since even Renee didn't fully understand what her mother had been hiding all these years. Tanya, meanwhile, made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Rather than joining the public narrative or granting interviews to the increasing number of reporters reaching out to her directly, she stayed almost entirely silent, posting only a brief statement asking for privacy for her family during a difficult time. Her silence, ironically, only fueled more speculation online, with some viewers praising her restraint and others accusing her of hiding something. What none of them knew was that Tanya was quietly doing her own research, using the birth certificate and photographs she'd found in that garage to try to piece together exactly who Diane Whitcombe really was before she became Diane Whitcombe. Renee became Tanya's unexpected ally during this period, the two women finally forming the kind of relationship that Diane's years of coldness had prevented. Renee had grown up sensing something unspoken in her mother's past, small inconsistencies and stories about her grandmother, a complete absence of any extended family from Diane's side beyond a few distant cousins nobody ever actually met. Together, Renee and Tanya began piecing together fragments, old photographs, the birth certificate with an unfamiliar name, a newspaper clipping mentioning a small town 200 miles from where Diane grew up, a town neither of them had ever heard Diane mention in nearly 40 years of family gatherings. The investigation, if it could be called that, led them first to public records offices, then to old newspaper archives available through a local library database. Renee discovered that the birth certificate Tanya had found didn't belong to Diane at all, but to a woman named Colleen Marsh, born in that same small town the same year as Diane. The photograph showed Colleen standing beside a man identified in a separate newspaper clipping as her husband, a man who had died in an industrial accident when Colleen was only 23 years old, leaving her a young widow with an infant daughter. That infant daughter's name, according to the clipping, was Diane. The revelation hit Renee and Tanya like a physical blow. Diane Whitcombe, the woman who had spent her entire life obsessing over family tradition, propriety, and appearances, had actually been born Diane Marsh, the daughter of a widow who remarried within 2 years to a man named Walter Whitcombe, Eleanor's second husband, who apparently adopted young Diane and gave her his last name. Somewhere in that transition, it seemed, the entire history of Colleen Marsh and her first husband had been erased, buried so thoroughly that even Diane's own children had never heard a single word about it in their entire lives. Renee brought this information to her father first, needing to understand whether Harold had known any of it. Harold's reaction told her everything she needed to know. He sat in stunned silence for nearly a full minute before admitting that Diane had once, decades earlier, mentioned in passing that her mother had been married before Walter, though Diane had shut down the conversation so quickly and completely that Harold assumed it was simply a painful subject better left untouched. He had no idea about Colleen Marsh's death, no idea about the industrial accident, and certainly no idea why any of this would have caused Diane to strike her daughter-in-law at a Christmas dinner decades later. The answer to that question came slowly, pieced together through additional newspaper archives that Tanya located during a late-night research session. The industrial accident that killed Colleen's first husband had occurred at a manufacturing plant, and the subsequent investigation revealed troubling safety violations that the company had concealed for years. Several families had sued the company, and in the resulting court proceedings, buried in old court records Tanya found through a persistent search, was testimony from Colleen Marsh herself, describing conditions at the plant, describing her husband's final days, describing a level of corporate negligence that had ended not just her husband's life, but 3 others in the same accident. What made this story more complicated, and what Tanya hadn't expected to find, was that Colleen's testimony had named names, including the plant's shift supervisor, a man who Tanya discovered, after several more hours of searching, was Eleanor's brother, meaning Diane's biological great-uncle had been directly implicated in covering up the safety violations that killed her father. This meant that Diane's family, on some level, had profited from and helped conceal a workplace tragedy that took her father's life before she was even old enough to remember him. A secret so deeply buried that Diane herself may have only learned fragments of it as she grew older within the Whitcombe household. Piecing together timeline and motive from decades-old records is never simple, but Tanya and Renee began to understand a pattern. Eleanor, ashamed of her family's connection to the scandal and desperate to protect her second marriage's respectability, had apparently erased Colleen Marsh entirely, rewriting the family narrative so completely that even Diane grew up believing Walter Whitcombe was her biological father. The photograph Renee found, the one that started everything at that Christmas dinner, must have survived by accident, a forgotten remnant of a life Eleanor tried desperately to bury along with her daughter's actual father and the truth about how he died. This new understanding reframed everything about Diane's coldness toward Tanya, though it didn't excuse the slap itself. Diane had spent her entire adult life terrified of exposure, terrified that someone would uncover the truth about her origins and, by extension, the scandal her mother had spent decades concealing. When Tanya, an outsider who had married into the family, began asking questions about old photographs and unfamiliar names, Diane's deepest fear, the fear of exposure and shame that had shaped her entire personality, resurfaced with a force she couldn't control. It wasn't about race, not directly, though Diane's years of subtle exclusion toward Tanya suggested layers of prejudice that existed independently of this buried family trauma. Grant struggled the most with this revelation, torn between newfound understanding for his mother's psychological wounds and continued anger over how she had treated his wife for years leading up to that dinner. He confronted Diane directly for the first time in his life, sitting across from her at her kitchen table nearly 3 weeks after the incident, asking her to finally tell him everything, without omission, without protecting anyone's feelings, including her own. Diane, for the first time in decades, did exactly that, speaking for nearly 2 hours about a childhood she had spent burying, about a mother who taught her that shame was something you hid rather than something you healed from. Diane admitted she had known fragments of the truth for years, overheard arguments as a child, comments from relatives who quickly silenced themselves whenever young Diane entered a room. She had pieced together enough to understand that something shameful existed in her past, though she never knew the specifics until Renee and Tanya's research filled in the remaining gaps. She admitted, tearfully, that she had transferred her lifelong fear of exposure onto Tanya from the very beginning, sensing in her daughter-in-law's confidence and directness a threat to the careful facade Diane had spent her entire life constructing, a facade built on secrets she herself hadn't even fully understood. This confession, difficult as it was, still left the matter of the local news story unresolved. The reason Diane's name would appear on television screens across the region less than 2 weeks after that Christmas Eve dinner. That story, it turned out, had nothing directly to do with the slap at all. A local investigative journalist, following up on viewer tips after the viral video brought attention to the Whitcombe family name, had independently discovered the connection to the decades-old manufacturing plant scandal while researching unrelated corporate negligence cases from that era, a story he had been developing for months before the family's private drama gave it unexpected new relevance. The journalist's report, which aired on the local evening news exactly 13 days after the Christmas Eve incident, revealed publicly what Renee and Tanya had already discovered privately, connecting Diane Whitcombe's maiden name to the manufacturing scandal and to the cover-up implicating her extended family decades earlier. The report suggested that renewed interest in workplace safety violations from that era, spurred partly by ongoing litigation involving similar cases at other plants, had brought old records back into public view, records that happened to intersect with the Whitcombe family at the exact moment their private Christmas conflict had made their name recognizable to local audiences. Diane watched this news segment alone in her living room, Harold sitting beside her, holding her hand throughout the entire broadcast. For the first time in her adult life, the truth she had spent decades avoiding was no longer something she controlled, no longer something she could bury in a garage folder or a locked memory. She wept, not from anger or humiliation, but from something closer to relief. The exhausting weight of a lifelong secret finally set down, even if it had been taken from her rather than offered willingly. Harold squeezed her hand and told her, quietly, that he wished she had trusted him with this burden decades earlier. Tanya's reaction to the news segment was complicated in its own right. Part of her felt vindicated, having uncovered the truth Diane had hidden even from her own family. But a larger part of her felt something closer to sorrow, understanding now that the woman who had struck her at that dinner table was herself a product of generational trauma and inherited shame she had never fully processed or understood. This didn't erase the pain of the slap or the 2 years of quiet exclusion that preceded it, but it complicated Tanya's anger in ways she hadn't anticipated, forcing her to hold both accountability and compassion simultaneously. The family gathered again nearly 6 weeks after Christmas, a much smaller gathering than the original 19 relatives, just Diane, Harold, Grant, Tanya, Renee, and the children. Diane, for the first time in the entire relationship, apologized to Tanya directly, without qualification or excuse, acknowledging that her fear and shame had never justified the way she treated her, both in that single violent moment and in the 2 years of subtle exclusion that came before it. Tanya listened, and though she didn't offer immediate forgiveness, she acknowledged the apology and said she was willing to try rebuilding trust slowly on her own terms and timeline. Grant and Tanya's marriage survived the ordeal, though not without significant strain and several months of counseling that both of them credited with helping them communicate honestly about resentments Grant had allowed to fester through years of conflict avoidance mirroring his father's own patterns. Renee, meanwhile, found herself closer to her sister-in-law than she had ever been to anyone in her own generation of the family, the shared investigation into Diane's past having forged a bond neither woman expected but both came to value deeply as the months passed. As for Diane, the public exposure of her family's hidden history brought an unexpected consequence she hadn't anticipated. Several descendants of the other families affected by the manufacturing plant tragedy reached out after seeing the news segment. Families who had spent decades wondering about the full truth behind the accident that took their own relatives. Diane, for the first time, found herself in the position of helping others understand a tragedy her own family had helped conceal, an uncomfortable but ultimately meaningful process of accountability that slowly, gradually, began to replace the shame she had carried for over 50 years with something closer to purpose. This story raises questions that extend far beyond one family's Christmas dinner gone wrong. How much of who we become is shaped by secrets we never chose to inherit? How many of us carry fears and reactions rooted in family histories we don't fully understand ourselves? Diane Whitcombe spent her entire life protecting a secret she barely knew the details of, allowing inherited shame to poison relationships with people who deserved better from her, especially the daughter-in-law she nearly drove out of the family entirely before the truth finally surfaced. Was justice truly served here, or simply understanding? Would you have recognized the signs of buried trauma in someone you loved, or would you, like Grant, have needed a public reckoning to finally see clearly? We want to know what you think happened in your own reading of this story. Do you believe Diane deserves the forgiveness she eventually received from her family? Or do you think 2 years of exclusion followed by a public act of violence crossed a line that no buried trauma can fully explain? Let us know in the comments below, and if this story moved you, stay close, because our next case involves a family secret even more shocking than this one, a story about inheritance, betrayal, and a will that was never supposed to be found. Subscribe now so you never miss what happens next, and we'll see you in the following story.